So you may or may not be aware that this week at Temple, we had a very busy week actually, but one of the special things that happened was that we welcomed into our midst a sofer, a scribe, who was repairing our 7 Torah scrolls and making sure that they're kosher and that they're in the best shape they possibly can be to facilitate our reading and learning. His name was Neil Yerman. And we all had the opportunity, if you were in the building this week, people had the opportunity to watch him do his work. He had all the scrolls in the meeting room rolled to different places, and he had all sorts of different tools, and he was spending a lot of energy very meticulously repairing the parchment and repainting certain letters and making sure that the parchment not only was stitched to itself, but also adhered to the etzim, to the scroll itself, so that we could roll it and lift it and turn it without fear of tearing it apart. And the care that he took with this process as a scribe, and also the holiness that seemed to engulf him when he was doing it, he wore a tallis as he did it, it's such a holy act, really showed his consciousness of the fact that he was not only doing something that affected him, but affected all of us. It reminded me of a very simple truth that perhaps we don't talk about enough, and I wanted to share it with you as a brief Devar Torah before services begin and we pray together. This week, as I mentioned, we're finishing the book of Numbers, a parashah called Maseh, which literally means journeying, the journey of, and then we learn the journey of the children of Israel. And the Torah portion delineates all the stops that the Israelites made from the time that they left Egypt to the time that they arrived at the edge of the Promised Land, something like 42 different stops that they made in this itinerary. And it really reads like an itinerary. They traveled to this place and they stayed here a little while and then they got up and they went to the next place. It was like what I'm sure some of you may have prepared for your summer vacations. That's what it reads like at the beginning of this Torah portion. And it really brings home the fact that moving from place to place absolutely defines us as a people. Certainly Torahitically it does, because we learned that the entire substance of the Torah is this itinerary. From the moment that we leave Exodus 15 until the very end of Deuteronomy, we're moving from place to place. But not only in the Torah, it also has defined us historically, because here we are no longer in the Promised Land. We have moved. We've moved somewhere else. And certainly some of that moving had to do with expulsion and exile. The reason that we don't reside in the Holy Land anymore for many of our families is because there's expulsion after exile, and we were never permitted to go back until this moment in history. But it's also certainly about moving because of a desire to move. People wanted different kinds of lives, which is why Jews have moved throughout history. Certainly even something as common in our community as a move from Clarksdale or Greenville to Memphis or Atlanta, or moving from Chicago or Milwaukee to Miami. These are common treks for Jews. And yet, as we move, we always tend to stick together. But the fact is that we move from place to place with relative frequency. And I realized that one of the, not perhaps a negative consequence, but one of the consequences of moving as much as we do and of having to have portable learning is that our Torah scrolls are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to all sorts of different forces and factors. They're made of organic materials, as we know, and so they're affected by the weather, they're affected by the temperature, they're affected by oils and fluids in our hands and fingers, and everybody who touches them, and they're simply affected by time. That's why we have a sofer coming here every few years, to make sure that they're kept up in the way that they deserve. And we recognize that we have to do this kind of maintenance if our Torah scrolls are to survive. They otherwise will become so old and so difficult to read that they can't be of use to us anymore. And that's something that we're not willing to accept, because they are our tree of life. They're what makes up our community. It reminded me, the simple truth was, that I realized, is that the vulnerability of our Torah scrolls, mimics our vulnerability as a Jewish people itself. Our vulnerability is made real by the fact that we journey and that we have a transient existence in place to place. And so we don't have the luxury, most of us, of being somewhere that we've been for thousands of years. Some do, but most of us don't. We are human beings, just like the Torah, who hold a Jewish text inside of us and whose experiences make up the text of our lives. So just like our Torah, our Judaism also suffers wear and tear. It gets stale sometimes. It gets tired. It gets hard to access over time. And certainly when we don't generate the text ourselves, when we live off the past only, when we're Jewish only because our parents were, or only because their parents were, that factor that makes it fall apart becomes more and more powerful. And certainly what we learned from this Sofer is that different environments make the Torah's destruction easier or harder. For example, we learned that in the middle of the desert in Egypt, a Torah scroll lasts longer than it does in Memphis, Tennessee, because of the humidity. And so the same thing, I think, is true for us as Jews. The more isolated we are, the more unwelcome we are in outside realms and other parts of society, the less forces are acting on us to change our Judaism. But when we had the luxury of being accepted as we are here in America and certainly in our community, when we're assimilated, when we're acculturated, we are constantly victims of the element, and our Judaism does have to withstand more and more factors that try to change it. And just like the scribe whose entire vocation is repairing our Torah scrolls, we have the responsibility to be scribes for our own Jewish texts. So just like a scribe comes to maintain our Torahs, he doesn't change the story, he simply refreshes the way it's presented, darkening those letters, stitching up the parchment, making sure it's on the eight seam as it should be. We have to do this kind of work on our Jewish selves. If we don't, the Jewish text in our lives and communities will fade and wither and tear and fray, just like the unattended Torah. So we do this by learning. We do this by praying in old and new ways. We do this by experiencing communities at different points in our lives, not just when we're children, but when we're adults, not just when we're parents, but when we're singles, when we're empty nesters, when we're elderly. Looking at each new problem is another way to do this, looking at each new problem through Jewish eyes, as these young people from AJSS are doing with us here tonight, not relying on the passion of our ancestors to do tikkun olam, being proud of their passion, for example, for civil rights, or proud of the way that they came together to save Soviet Jewry. We must ask ourselves, what are the causes that exist in our time that we must respond to with a prophetic imperative? We cannot rest on their achievements any more than we can rest on them mending the Torah 50 years ago and hoping that it will still be strong and like new. So we, like the Torah, are living, breathing Jewish texts. And therefore, we need to devote time to ourselves for maintenance and rejuvenation if we are to last as long as our holy scrolls. Journeying strengthens us in many ways, and one is by making us resilient and determined, and even when we feel we've reached the promised land, we must continue to be that way. So as we pray together tonight, I pray that our journeys lead us to a place of courage and conviction, no matter how long we've been on them. May we have the strength to beautify the stories that lie inside us and throughout our lives, never taking our Jewish selves for granted, and rejoicing as our scribes do in repairing and renewing our Jewish story, the care that it takes to do so, as well as the holiness it evokes. So as we end this book of the Torah and move to Deuteronomy, as we face the coming new year with challenges that are new and also tools that are eternal, we can say, as we will tomorrow when we finish the Torah, Chazak, Chazak, v'nit chazek. Be strong, and may we be strengthened by one another on our journey. Shabbat Shalom.